So once more, I'm doing a comment or suggestion. In a previous video, somebody asked about the marble carvings in Honduras, specifically about the ones from the Ulua Valley. To be honest, I expected this to send me down a rabbit hole of Central American archaeology because I really don't know a lot about it. And I'm not alone. A lot of archaeologists don't know a lot about Central America either. But although there are only a small handful of scholars who work on the Ulua Valley, they've done a lot of very thorough work, and as it turns out, I can make a whole video out of the Ulua Valley on its own. What I did not expect was for it to send me down a rabbit hole of plunder. Naturally, with archaeology, you always have a risk of plunder, but this region in particular surprised me. Because while you always get a few bad actors and you can't place protection at every site, here it seems to be an organized and streamlined process by locals specifically to avoid or minimize legal ramifications. Indeed, every paper I've read mentions just how big an issue looting is, a pattern I haven't even seen in Egyptian, biblical, or Roman archaeological papers. Some sites are so bad it's impossible to dig a square meter without finding evidence of looting. Of around 160 marble vessels that can be studied in museums, more than half were salvaged from the black market. Now, keep that in mind because this is going to affect a lot of the interpretations I'm going to get into. It also means that I'm going to be speaking about two things today: the Ulua Valley and the plunder associated with it. Because as it turns out, these types of marbles have a long history of being desired by foreigners and fetched a high price even when they were brand new. So where is the Ulua Valley? Well, it's here in northwestern Honduras, a region that was, and in many ways still is, considered a peripheral region, both to the prehistoric societies and to the Spanish colonials. Settlement, which is to say a unique archaeological culture tied to sedentism, first arose here sometime before 1600 BCE in an era known as the early formative period, emerging around the site of Puerto Escondido. Already it was tied with wider Mesoamerican cultures, with pottery styles that suggested influence from the Pacific Guatemala region and Chiapas. Like all Mesoamerican cultures, maize became a staple of their diet, and they began farming it on a large scale. They were also considered part of the wider Olmec region starting in 1100 BCE, which was the first major North American civilization. The Ulua Valley is sometimes considered a part of the Mayan culture and is frequently shown in maps to be within the range of Mayan control. But the more I looked into it, the more modern scholarship seems to not really support this view. The people of the Ulua Valley, it is generally agreed today, were a different people entirely. In fact, it's been suggested that they didn't even speak the same language. However, one can see why the mistake might be made. The Ulua Valley took a lot of influence from the Maya, and the Mayan cities were absolutely vital to the region's prosperity. As a result, the Ulua Valley's chronology follows Mayan chronology. At least this is the accepted view. Stone artifacts are difficult to date at the best of times, and even in the modern era we are limited to a few different isotope analyses, but even these are dependent on certain factors. I won't bore you with the details, but these are not the best of circumstances. Remember, so much of what we know has come from looted artifacts. So while the Ulua were tightly tied to the Mayans, it's important to keep in mind that their timelines matching is just an educated guess. It's probably a safe guess, and it's certainly close if not correct, but nothing has confirmed it either. Ulua Valley culture had multiple centers, and it was likely never one unified kingdom, which was a similar story to the Maya. However, the largest city in the Ulua Valley appears to be Travesia, often referred to as a capital, even though, again, the valley was likely never unified. But the valley is very strategically placed to be important. In addition to it being quite fertile and able to support a large population, the Ulua also had access to the Atlantic, allowing them to sail along the coast of the Mayan heartlands in the Yucatan. Not that they needed to sail, as Honduras' own Mayan city, Copan, could easily be reached by sailing up one of these same rivers. This position was especially important as the Ulua traded far and wide. Acting as a bridge between the Mayan lands and Nicaragua, the Ulua were able to grow very, very wealthy. Their goods have been found as far south as Panama and throughout the Mayan heartlands, and likewise goods from Panama and central Mexico have found their way to the Ulua. Their most important and valuable export was cocoa, which brought untold riches to any lands lucky enough to grow it. It's hard to understate the significance of the cocoa trade in North America, and it might best be compared to Eurasia's spice trade in terms of how rich it could make those who produced it. But cocoa is organic and it was meant to be consumed, so finding the exact scale of this trade is very difficult due to not a lot of it surviving. Something a bit more traceable are their stone vessels and polychrome pottery, both of which offer a distinct style. Both the pottery and the marble vessels have been found in fragmentary contexts together, but it's the stone vessels that are the valuable ones. How these marble vessels were used is uncertain due to the vast majority of them being looted. Again, I'm gonna say this a lot, but it is believed that they were highly valued luxury goods used for ceremonial purposes. But unlike the usual archaeological excuse of calling something you don't know ceremonial, there is actual logical reasoning behind this interpretation. For one thing, many of the depictions on these ceramics are clearly religious. Figures, both male and female, are shown with pointed teeth, elaborate headdresses, ceremonial clothes, and makeup, and all of the other hallmarks of this Central American religious imagery. They've been found both in graves and in the context of living spaces, and what's more, they seem to have been made to order. Some of these vessels seem to have been made with distant lands in mind during their manufacture, suggesting that they were made with a specific purpose. Some stone vessels also came with elaborately carved tripods as well, which matches the context of vessels found in temples and in ceremonial settings. Finally, they've also been found not only in mortuary spaces, but also in living spaces where we would expect to see a ceremonial use. But even experts in the field acknowledge that this theory has flaws. Because so many of these vessels are only known through looting, we simply do not have a good context for them. And as to the religious ceremonies depicted, well, drinking your coffee from a Jesus mug doesn't turn your breakfast into a church sermon. It can also be reasonably argued that most art from the pre-Columbian period is going to have highly religious and ceremonial themes, and among Mesoamerican cultures in particular, the gods were ever present. More than a few even needed constant ceremony or fresh blood to keep their power functioning, sort of like a divine spell or an elixir. An alternate theory claims that these different designs may have been the mark of which city it was made in. The Ulua are not thought to have been under one unified king. Trevesia was an important city, however that may be because the valley's source of marble was near Trevesia, giving it a special sort of leverage over the importance as it may have been able to bottleneck the supply of raw materials. But in the final manufacture, cities may well have put their own Marcon vessels they shipped out to drum up more business and compete with each other. Non-religious exchanges in these vessels seem to have occurred as well through third and fourth party traders, in particular in the Guanacaste province of Costa Rica. Plus, one vessel being used for religious purposes is not proof that all of them were, and vice versa. It should also be noted that not all decorations can be so solidly tied to ceremony. Like the Mayans, the Ulua had a love of animals on their vessels, and in particular they carved them into handles. Some of these shapes incised into the main body are purely geometric, and it would be a mistake to tie either of these to ceremonial use without further context. But there is a strong argument for them to be ceremonial. And whatever the use, these vessels were prized. They were seen as high-priced luxury goods throughout the first millennium CE when the Mayans, and presumably the Ulua, were at their peak of civilization. So what did this civilization actually look like? I make it sound quite rich and prosperous, and indeed there were periods where it was. They didn't just trade luxury and ceremonial goods and cocoa. They also traded raw materials and mundane everyday items like marine goods from the coast, jade, obsidian, and quetzals. But they were still a periphery, and all of this prosperity was tied very tightly to the Mayan civilization, the source of all wealth in the region. So it's not surprising that we see a lot of Mayan influence among the Ulua, especially in their architecture. The Ulua began building villages on platforms around 700 BCE, not long after this trend appears in the precursors to the Mayan states. They, too, were enthralled with ball courts, but this isn't surprising as ball courts for games were popular across the southern half of the continent. They also began to develop a hierarchy as villages seemed to be organized around rivers and large city centers. The society is thought to have hit a high point from about 500 to 850 CE, right when the neighboring Maya were in their classical age. But this hierarchy was not necessarily feudal. Rosemary Joyce in particular stands out as the Ulua Valley scholar who advocates for a heterarchy. Joyce posits that the Ulua had the freedom of movement and the right to refuse commands, so cities could be depopulated not through warfare or revolution, but by a peaceful and purposeful choice. If the people no longer felt like working and opted to move, they did so. And this isn't too different from the idea of our own societies, is it? Whole industries and businesses will fall apart if people decide it's just not worth it to stick around and have the freedom to leave. Cities can be depopulated when the wealth dries up too, no violence needed, as numerous abandoned gold rush towns in the Arctic can attest to. And while it enjoyed centuries of wealth, the Ulua Valley did eventually decline. Just as the spice traders are only as wealthy as the people they sold to, the Ulua were only as rich as their wealthiest buyers, in this case the Mayans. Its decline, unsurprisingly, is tied to the decline of Mayan society overall. After Copan's influence waned, the Ulua Valley's main hub of transport to the wider Mayan world also declined. And while they did shift focus, in particular to Palenque, the heyday of their civilization ended within about a century following 850 CE. Ulua trade was still occurring, with marble vessels being found in Belize from the 10th century, but it was obvious that the Golden Age was over. Now, this isn't to say that life in the Ulua Valley itself declined, in particular if we accept Joyce's heterarchy model that allows for some sort of free movement. If locals no longer found as much profit in the old trades and urban centers, they may have easily shifted back to rural lifestyles or to industries that did generate more wealth. Textiles, maize, and a return to cocoa are all strong possibilities, and none of them would preserve well in the archaeological record. Marble vessels may have also simply just fallen out of style, and the collapse of Mayan wealth meant that the expense was no longer justified. There is a genuine argument to be had on if this can be called a decline at all, rather than sort of a restructuring. This movement of people is difficult to confirm, however, in particular because after about 1100, the Ulua stopped building on large stone platforms, meaning that their new settlements have long since been flooded, unprotected from the ever-changing rivers, typhoons, flood seasons, and encroaching rainforests. And as the Mayan world devolved into a period of civil strife and warfare, it's inconceivable that the Ulua would not also have been involved in some capacity. At the very least, their main source of wealth would have collapsed, even if no other fighting occurred in Ulua lands. After about 1300, all trace of the Ulua civilization disappears. And when the Spanish first made contact in 1521, the natives had already been ravaged by smallpox, so whatever society had taken its place would have been brought to its knees by the time contact occurred. It's not known how many natives died of the plague, but some estimates claim up to 70% of native populations were destroyed by European diseases before the Europeans ever even met them. Even the lowest estimates still make the Black Death look like flu season, and that was before they contended with European invaders. Since then, this region has been extensively looted. It has been widespread and systemic, and it continues to this day. Exactly why looting happens isn't hard to figure out. Things go for a lot of money on the black market to private collectors and art dealers. A lot of these artifacts seen worldwide across museums are the results of looting salvaged from the black market. But not all of them. Some are the results of earlier expeditions which took place in the 1890s, 1940s, and 1970s to 80s. Many countries have repatriation agreements with Honduras, so most Ulua Valley artifacts will be in museums with permission of the Honduran government. Now, I was surprised at just how extensive the issue of looting is in the Ulua Valley. Honduras, like most countries, has a law to complete any archaeological work ahead of all major development projects. I'm particularly familiar with it because that's the sort of archaeology I do. And I know firsthand how annoyed developers can get with us. We are known to delay projects, increase costs, and sometimes even change their plans, especially if we find something big and complex. So to avoid this, many of the landowners in this region of Honduras in particular seem to coordinate and organize looting very quickly. To give you one of the anecdotes I found, Honduras declared Calabazas in this region a protected city. So the landowners sold it, and construction began leveling and looting the site illegally within hours. Apparently under the cover of night, too. Authorities arrived just days later, but they worked fast, and 19 of the city's 20 mounds were destroyed. And this happens because developers feel that it's just too much hassle to save this stuff. Why should they be spending more money to slow down the project? It's just your own history and culture after all, what's that going to pay you? But unfortunately, too much of our society has the view that if it cannot turn a profit, it's not worth the trouble. Speaking of which, help me turn a profit. I provide these videos for free in my free time, and you can help me out just by liking and subscribing. Okay, so I'm a bit cynical. But I'm not as hard on it as the Hondurans should be. Because the fact is, when you destroy cultural heritage, it's the people who live on the land that you're hurting. And when it's your land, it's your community you're hurting most. You are almost literally burning your own family history. Yet, the promise of a bit more money proves an allure to too many people, especially in countries that don't have a lot of it in the first place. This has also, as you can imagine, driven a market in fakes. More than a few of these vessels are fakes from the early 20th century sold to collectors who did not learn how to tell the difference. But most of these things in museums will have been checked and will be authentic. But if you're unsure about whether it's from the black market from an actual expedition, check the museum's label. In a case like this, vessels saved from the black market will be given general provenances from certain regions. Those acquired through legitimate expeditions will be much more specific. So unfortunately, there are many questions that will never be answered. Rampant looting continues as Honduras lacks the resources to adequately enforce its own laws, and this region continues to be a periphery to the wider world. Even so, the Ulua Valley has a fascinating history, one that we are finally starting to study more in depth, and one that we will continue to learn more about, whatever obstacles we face. It grew large and rich through their trade and local resources, and they proved that being on the periphery doesn't make you a backwater. So anyway, thanks for making it to the end, and thank you again to commenters. I really enjoyed learning about this because honestly, I knew nothing about it going into it. Doing things like this really rekindles my passion and reminds me why I got into archaeology in the first place, so do leave suggestions in the comment section, and who knows, you might find your topic come up in a future video. Anyway, that's all I have on the Ulua Valley for today. Until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.